Hello, everyone. We're so happy you joined us today. I'm Dr. Beth McDougall, and I have the distinct pleasure today to introduce our next guest and my co-host, Dr. Helané Wahbeh. She's the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Science, IONS, where she studies mind-body medicine and extended human capacities. Helané has championed the IONS Channeling Research Program, supporting rigorous research of our ability to access information and energy not limited by space and time. Welcome, Helané. I've been a huge fan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences for a really long time and have followed the work and research of many of the scientists that you support there. So how long have you been Director of Research at IONS?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And yes, I'm so grateful to be here and to be acting as Director of Research. I've been at IONS for about 8 years now, doing this incredible work.
I love what you're studying there. And I know today we're going to discuss the research on consciousness healing and the various facets of consciousness healing, but maybe right off the bat, describe what you mean by consciousness healing.
Yes, I wanted to focus today on consciousness and how it influences healing in the physical world. And people might wonder, well, how could that be? Because our dominant materialist paradigm tells us that our consciousness is actually limited to our physical brain, that it is housed in our brain. It can't affect anything beyond our brain or our physical body. But as many of you may already know, there's much evidence from different scientific programs showing that consciousness does actually extend the physical brain. And likely there are some aspects of consciousness that are not dependent on the brain, that in fact consciousness is non-local. And we're moving into what is now called the post-materialist paradigm, where it supports that notion. And I'm excited to tell you a little bit about where these ideas are coming from. And we see them in multiple experimental paradigms. Just as one example, there's one called the Distant Mental Intention of Living Systems protocol. So imagine that yourself and a friend go to participate in this study at the laboratory. Yourself, you're going to be the receiver. And so you go into this room, you get hooked up to devices that measure your brain waves, heart rates, skin conductance, and you just are in a relaxed state in this room. Your friends in a totally different room, different part of the building, they too are hooked up to all of these devices, and they have a screen in front of them. And whenever they see your picture, they direct positive intentions towards you. And then your picture goes away. And so they collate all this data from yourself, from your friends, and they compare the instances where your friend was directing this positive intention versus when they weren't. And what's incredible is that we see a clear difference in our physiology, in the body of yourself, the receiver, and in the sender when you're sending versus not sending. And that this change actually appears to be instantaneous. So it's incredible to think about that. And if we think of our consciousness being stuck in our brain, there's no way that that could happen, right? So what is this aspect of consciousness that actually can influence other people at a distance and instantaneously?
Wow, that's so incredible. And is that the research on positive intention that you're talking about, or have you done studies on positive intention that are separate from that?
So that's one example of directing positive intention to another human. There's been a number of other studies looking at positive healing intention on many other things, on cells in vitro, on plants, on animals, on non-human primates. And so the experiments are generally the same, which is someone is directing positive healing intention to a target. And what's wonderful is that these studies, in the one I mentioned before, the DMELs and in cells, plants, etc., in various labs around the world. So there have been a number of them so that we can actually collate the data from all those studies into what's called a meta-analysis. That's where we take all the data and we look at it together. And what those show us is that there is a clear effect. Now, considering that we may imagine that our consciousness is stuck in our brain, there should be zero effect. There should be no effect of me directing positive intention to anything else. And yet we're seeing a clear effect. Now, these effects are on the smaller side. They range about 0.2, 0.25, which is maybe like a weak behavioral intervention, psychological intervention, but it's not zero. There's something going on there. So it's really exciting to see that work expanding now in various other studies.
Yeah. And just since being immersed in this research for so long, what are your theories about how the benefits are traveling to the individual? Do you feel like there really is no separation of space and time, and what's happening in one person is then simultaneously happening in the other? Or how do you imagine this is proceeding?
That's a great question. And the short, quick answer is we're not sure. However, there's a lot of people who have different ideas about the mechanism or essentially how it works. What is generally clear is that it doesn't work like a force. So we've all seen these wonderful Hollywood movies where someone has a superpower and we see like a red light shooting out of someone's eyes and traveling to another person. It likely does not work in that way, where it is a force that's moving from point A to point B. And the reason we think that's true is because so many of these studies are showing instantaneous effects. So if I'm in New York and the person I'm intending is in San Francisco and I'm seeing it shifting instantaneously, then it can't be a force because that force would take time to travel from New York to San Francisco. So we know it's likely not that. Now, there's also this concept that we're all interconnected. So at the Big Bang, we were all one thing. Everything expanded from there. And that's being supported in various other fields like cosmology and quantum physics. There's this whole idea of entanglement where we can take two photons or other things that they're using in the lab now that are actually larger than photons, and we can entangle them in some way, a pair of photons. We can take one halfway across the world, and if we move the spin of one, the other one spins in the same way instantaneously. So this is just a basic level example of entanglement. And this has been replicated in many, many different labs with small molecules, small diamonds, even light from quasars, huge quasars out in the universe. So I'm not a physicist. I can't speak to the specific details around that, but that gives us a little bit of a foundation of perhaps why we could intend and have someone feel it, or perhaps know what someone was feeling or thinking at a far distance.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, there are so many theories, and I'd love to get into them all, but maybe tell me a little bit about some of the other facets of consciousness healing you've looked at. What about energy medicine? What kind of studies have you and IONS done on energy medicine?
Yes, there's a wonderful and growing literature around energy medicine, things like Reiki, therapeutic touch. There's been some reviews showing evidence around that, especially for things like pain and improved quality of life in cancer and anxiety, mental health aspects as well. We've done a number of studies at IONS. We did a large one a few years ago, and that was with people who had hand and wrist pain. It was about 200 people. And we had 17 different energy medicine practitioners from a variety of different traditions. And they gave one 30-minute energy medicine session to these people with hand and wrist pain. What was special about this study was that we did many different types of measures. For example, we looked at how fast the signal was conducted along the nerve of their affected hands and wrists to see if that changed from before to after the session. We also looked at pain, of course, to see if that shifted, and we did see a clear shift in that from immediately after the 30-minute session and also 3 weeks later. There were two other measures we did that were quite unique. We wanted to get at how this works, right? So we had samples of water in vials on the practitioner and also on the participant. And we looked at how that water changed during the session. And what was fascinating is we saw changes in the water that the practitioner was wearing. And the measure we looked at was the distance and the angle of the hydrogen-oxygen bond. And we saw a shift in that, which was quite profound when you think of how much our bodies are actually water. We also saw changes when the practitioner was just doing a hands-on healing of a glass of water itself. So that was unique and interesting. And then we also had devices in there called quantum noise generators. And those basically generate random noise, random data. And there's no reason to expect that it would deviate from randomness, that it would get more ordered. And so we looked at this data during the healing sessions versus the non-healing. So when people were in there but not healing and afterwards. And we found clear differences in that random noise. So what does this mean? We're essentially envisioning that somehow the environment becomes more ordered during this healing session. And that leads back to your previous question about, well, how does this all work? There's all these pieces that are coming up around information, that somehow everything is informational, and being able to affect the information that makes us up can somehow manifest these shifts in our bodies in some way. So these devices, these quantum noise generator devices, we've now created a large board that has many of them on them, and we're continuing the work to see if there are shifts on that large board. So for example, let's say I hold it over my heart chakra, and then we do readings before healing, and then someone does intense work over that area, and then we see if those readings shift. So it might be a way to envision the biofield, if you will, and changes in the biofield with this informational QNG.
What a great way to visualize. And I would think also another mechanism probably you've discussed is coherency. As you're diminishing the noise, there is greater level of coherency in the field. And I feel if someone's exposed to a coherent field, it amplifies the exchange of energy and information from the quantum field at large that we're all derived from. So I could, with more energy and greater access to the appropriate information, healing could occur. So it's another theory.
Yes, that was actually another measure we did was we looked at the coherence between the heart signals of the practitioner and the participant. And we looked at a number of those different measures, and only one of them was coherent, but it was really fascinating to see that there was a coherence in how their heartbeat started moving together.
So interesting. And you've also done research on prayer. Can you talk about that?
Yes, we have not specifically on prayer, but another aspect of healing, if you will, where we've collected information about spontaneous remissions. And some of these include prayer and some of them don't. So, IONS published this large spontaneous remission bibliography that many of you in the audience may know about. It was very inspiring to so many people. And we have now embarked on a very large project to update that, to make it available online, and to have it be a functional database that people can search, that they could potentially add cases to, etc. So that's specifically for cancer spontaneous remission. There have also been a number of studies looking at prayer that are around surgeries and healing times and after the surgery, and also anxiety prior to the surgery with some preliminary positive effects. There was one large study around prayer that found a negative finding, and it was published in a really large journal. And so some researchers have been less apt to look at prayer in a non-controlled way because there's just so many variables that can be at play in terms of looking at that. But when you talk to people and you hear about the anecdotes, there are so many people who say that they've been helped by prayer, that they are in group prayer circles where they have seen incredible results. These prayer circles can be in churches, they can be in spiritualist communities, they can be so many different places where people positively intend for specific outcomes in a group. There's also Lynn McTaggart's Power of Eight group. So there's so many groups around the world that use this prayer or power of intention, whatever you want to call it. And there's nuances that we could probably get into about the differences between those. But I feel like it's this untapped research area that would be wonderful to dive more into.
Absolutely. And like you said, there are so many variables there because you've got, the power of one person praying for another versus the power of multiple people praying for another. And there's different ways of praying. It's not all one thing. So, though if you're visualizing a positive outcome, that might be different than, asking for a negative outcome to be relieved. So I see what you mean. There's so many variables there. But it is true that anecdotes are stacking up. And in the database that you described, how many people how many spontaneous remissions are in the database thus far?
Oh, there's hundreds and hundreds of cases. And what's fascinating is that those are specifically already published. So that doesn't even include anecdotes from people reporting it themselves. These are cases that were in the literature already that we are collating. So if you translate that into all the ones that actually exist that haven't been published, the numbers are staggering.
Wow, amazing. Did you study medical intuition?
Yes. So that large study that I told you about with the 200 patients with hand and wrist pain, we're also, in the effort to try to understand how this works, we had what we call a clairvoyant seer sitting in the room for each and every one of those almost 200 sessions, which was incredible. And she would take notes and write out what she was observing in the space, what was happening with the practitioner, what was happening in the participant, how things were shifting. And at the end of that, we ended up with this vast amount of data that we analyzed using qualitative analysis, pulling out various themes that arose as common amongst those sessions. We also looked at those themes in relationship to how much improvement the participants had. So was there anything that arose that was predictive of having more improvements than other people? So we published that paper. It was a really fascinating study. We saw some indications with color. We also saw when the clairvoyant seer observed non-physical beings in the space, that there was a better outcome. Now, we can't prove whether that was really true or not. These are supposed non-physical beings. And yet that was really interesting. And so the biggest criticism we got around that study was that it was just one seer. They're like, this is just one person's perspective. So we did a follow-up study where we had 40 participants who had either memory problems, anxiety, depression, or an acute injury. And we had 6 Reiki masters. This time we limited the type of energy medicine to one specific type. And each of the 40 participants received one 30-minute Reiki session. At the same time, we had 6 clairvoyant seers or medical intuitives observing the sessions. And we collected their perceptions in a variety of different ways. We had them fill out check boxes for the different energetic movements, and those were the themes that we got from our previous study. We also had them write out all their observations during the session, which we videotaped from the ceiling. Then we also asked them to write out, do check boxes for the various symptoms they thought the participant had before the session. And then we repeated those after the session as well. And then we took all of that information across the 6 different seers, and we collated it and tried to see if there was a corroboration across those 6 seers for what they were seeing. Now, this was such an incredible process because we selected seers that could actually said that they could see colors, they could see things in the physical space. And so we envisioned that that was the only type of information that we would receive. But we received things about, past lives, mental, emotional, physical, old trauma. It was like standing in front of a fire hydrant of data, just all the data that was poured out. Despite that, we found some clear corroboration around the multiple measures that we collected. I think most importantly was that the symptoms that they saw in the participant were corroborated across the seers and also with the participants' report about what the symptoms they actually had. So that was a really wonderful and fascinating study. We learned so much from it, and we've created another study design to take it one step further, because medical intuition in an effort to support people going through their health care path could really benefit other healthcare practitioners, to give them perhaps insight or validation or looking at things from a different perspective, especially in difficult cases where people have sought out treatment but weren't able to have any positive results. And so we are working with medical doctors for this study. It's essentially a pragmatic trial, and the primary outcome is not necessarily accuracy, but if the medical doctor found the feedback that the medical intuitive gives is useful, if they would use it again, if it corroborated or validated any of their existing treatment plans and gave them insight into future treatment plans. So we're really excited about that. We're seeking some funding so that we can do that follow-up study.
Well, as a medical doctor, I think that's incredibly valuable. And I studied at the Academy of Intuition Medicine myself, and being able to bring my own intuitive insights to my interactions with patients has just, taken my ability to help people up a whole quantum level. So it's just, it's amazing that the Institute of Noetic Sciences is taking this on and doing these rigorous studies. You are kind of one of a kind in terms of centers around the world doing this type of research work. I'm so happy you exist. Now you've been, I mean, when you're able to interact with these clairvoyants and these different energy healers, and do you feel that being able to do these things is kind of a special skill that only some people have, or do you feel like everyone has the capacity to be intuitive or to have healing skills?
So I personally propose that we all have the innate ability to do this, to have this capacity to heal or to see, etc. But that sometimes the way it shows up for each individual is unique to them. So their ability to receive information beyond our five senses may be very visual, or they may feel it in their body, or they may hear words in their mind, or they may get visual mental impressions somehow. And so I think that anyone can do it, but that they may have strengths that lie in a specific way of doing it. And I've talked to so many different teachers who said it can also be trained. So even though you may not be born with this incredible talent that just shows up spontaneously, if you believe that you can do it and you practice it, that the likelihood is that you can improve this ability to either heal or to perceive what is going on. And this is really backed up by our whole Noetic Signature program at IONS, where we have done 4 different studies now looking at how what we call the Noetic Signature, or your unique expression of this innate capacity, shows up for people. And we see that healing is its own individual characteristic, one of 12, and that this seeing and these intuitive capacities are also multiple of the other 12 characteristics. And interestingly, there's a whole one that showed up by itself about intending and visualizing, that those two, this effect of consciousness on the physical world, showed up as its own characteristic from the data. So that was amazing.
Can you just list off a couple of the others?
Yes, absolutely. So the first and the biggest one was what we might call general intuition. So some people say, I just know it. I just know it. Or I just feel it. They just feel it in their body. Another is mind to mind communication, or what some call telepathy. I mentioned healing. I mentioned visualizing and intending. There's also apparent communication with non-physical beings that might cover things like mediumship and trance channeling. There's feeling things in your body. So I get goosebumps. That's like my major truthometer. So other people might get goosebumps or tingles or feel heat in their body. Others might feel other people's emotions. Other people might feel other people's physical sensations. And finally, there is the feeling in your body. It's not just a goosebumps, it's like a general gut hunch feeling. So that just gives you a nice taste of the various 12 characteristics that we found from the noetic signature.
That's valuable. Love that work. And you've experienced a lot of these modalities personally. Can you share about your experiences?
Yes, I have received numerous energy medicine and healing sessions. The most remarkable was when I was a teenager and my uncle was a channeler and healer. And I had a really bad horseback riding accident where I couldn't move my legs. And he put his hands on my back, and I felt this incredible, intense heat radiating throughout my body. And then the pain just dissipated, and I was able to move my legs again. It was quite remarkable. So that's kind of my most dramatic personal story of being on the receiving end of healing. In my private practice, when I was seeing patients, I would often get downloads or receive information that supported me in helping my patients. They might mention a symptom, and then I'd get just this big download of information about what the root cause may have been. And then I would start asking questions, and lo and behold, it would end up to be true. And they'd often have some cathartic release when I brought it up that would then just shift their symptomology. So it's just such a beautiful, incredible gift that I feel so grateful for. And I'm excited to support and nurture other people to understand that this really is an innate gift that we all have, that we can empower ourselves to use in our daily lives to help ourselves and to also help others.
Yes. Well, I imagine that experience after your horseback riding accident really set you on a trajectory in this direction. And how did you find your way to ions?
So I'm trained as a naturopathic physician. I was in private practice for quite a while and just became so curious and inspired to know how things work, especially how our mind affects our health and our body. That was my specialty, was mind body medicine. So I got back into research field, started doing clinical research, and specifically on meditation and mindfulness, and worked with combat veterans with post traumatic stress disorder, looking at how mindfulness could support them with their symptoms. So I became an expert in the meditation research field and was invited to go to IONS, where they were having a focus group with multiple expert meditation researchers about the future of meditation. Why were we only asking certain questions in the Western research field around this? Why weren't we asking more esoteric questions or including the spiritual aspects and the psychic aspects, etc.? So that was the first experience I had with ions, and it just completely blew me away. And I said, I want to work here. I said, what's going on? You are so courageous to be asking these research questions. How can I become involved? And so that started a beautiful cascade of events that ended in me joining the team, and then shortly thereafter becoming director of research. And so now I'm so grateful because I can bring my personal experiences of energy medicine, of channeling, of all these um, post-materialist phenomenon with my clinical experience, my research experience, and be able to tie them all together to bring this work forward into the world in a very accessible but also rigorous way. So we can say, hey, this stuff exists, it's real, let's show you the evidence so that you don't have to be afraid of it, you don't have to hide. your experiences of this and provide everybody with the resources to be able to explore it even further.
Ah, well, you are living your dharma. It's a beautiful thing, and you're contributing so much to our understanding. So, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And what do you think's the most important take-home message the audience should know about consciousness and healing?
I think the most empowering message is that their consciousness matters, their intention matters, and that where you direct your intention is important. So if you're running negative mental dialogues all day, that can affect your health. And we didn't get into psychoneuroimmunology, but it's really clear now that our mental state and our psychology affects our health in a dramatic way. And that when we direct our intention in a positive way, and it's not in a Pollyanna way, it's essentially visualizing the outcome that you want to see happen, that affects your physiology in a positive way. And it's also not to then blame ourselves for, oh, something bad happened. It's all my fault. It's not to turn it internal and be victim, but to be empowered to know that your thoughts, your intention matters. And it's a clear thing that you can do to support yourself to achieve your optimal health and well-being and thrive.
Beautiful. Well, how can people find out more about the Institute of Noetic Sciences and your work?
They can go to our beautiful website that has all of our publications and studies and additional resources and links at noetic, noetic.org.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.